mostly questions from the floor. If you represent Fairfax Media, the Australian or the Daily Telegraph, you might like to say something. Okay, first question.
Hi. Hi, Michael. I'm glad you're here. I really appreciate your arguments about the question of disrupting the KEMP speaker and the fact that the ensuing discussion, in fact, ignored the issues confronting the Palestinians and the fact of how horrendous KEMP himself is. And I think that was important, and the point you made about the situation, about people's understanding of what's going on. Most of the people there, I think, would not have been aware of who KEMP was. But I think your discussion of BDS was lacking on the same basis, because, you know, we're so far behind here in Australia in terms of the progress of the BDS campaign. In the UK and Europe and the US, it's far more advanced. And I think the reason that BDS has gained so much hysteria around it is as a result of the energetic work of the Israel lobby. Pardon me? And the question that really gets them is the right of return of Palestinians. The three demands of the BDS campaign: a right of return of Palestinians, withdrawal from lands occupied in '67, and equality with Palestinians in the State of Israel. And the right of return is the sensitive one because it is not compatible with the current Zionist view of a Jewish majoritarian state as the idea of a Jewish homeland. And this is the problematic. This is why they are so wedded to this Jewish majoritarian idea that it equals the destruction of Israel, and for many people that goes to destruction of the Jewish people. And that's where we get this constant illusion in a quite mendacious way around what BDS is. But that is a communication issue, and you know, we constantly have this communication problem about this. So this question of making a judgment of where we are and what our political situation is, and when we have a space for debate, I don't think it's appropriate to disrupt that space.
Yeah, I think you agree with me that the media landscape is not very friendly to criticisms of the Israeli government. And so, because we know that we're in a hostile media landscape, the question is, well, what can we do which will be the most effective? Now, a boycott of the settlements isn't radical. You know, in some ways it's a very moderate thing to do. Like, you're not going to accept, you're not going to buy, like if you say we're not going to buy from a sweatshop, everyone gets that. You know, you don't say someone's anti-China because they don't want to buy from exploited laborers in China. Like, it's a very contained issue and it's easy to understand. And saying that about the settlements is really straightforward too. I read an article the other day by Vivian will probably know who I'm talking about, no one else will. His name's Philip Mendes. And he's an academic in Melbourne, and he's kind of the chief, I don't want to be too defamatory here. He has a very long list of people who he calls anti-Semitic. And people who he calls out anti-Semitic are people who talk about the Israel lobby, people who criticize the Israeli government in mean ways, people who call for a right of return, all of that's anti-Semitic. And he claims to be left-wing, but most of what he writes is about how someone or other is anti-Semitic, like John Pilger, probably Stuart Rees, Jake Lynch, and so on. He had an article the other day, and as usual, he was saying how BDS is anti-Semitic. And then he made a very interesting concession. He said, maybe settlements boycotts are reasonable. Now, this guy is kind of off the spectrum in terms of reasonable discussion, but even he can see there is a case to be made for people who oppose the occupation to boycott settlements. Now, the point, I think, is we should try to unite the greatest number of people, and that's where we should start. You know, when we had John Howard in power, and he won the Senate, he passed, you know, he tried to get through the work choices thing. And obviously, probably everyone here thought that was really terrible. But when it came to opposition to it, the various Marxist groups didn't say, you know, we shouldn't compromise and just oppose work choices, we need to abolish all of capitalism now. You know, people said, yes, work choices is the problem, and we'll start with work choices, and once we've built up that campaign, we'll move on to the next thing. And so I think that's why I say we should have a targeted boycott campaign, because that's where you start, and we can work on forwards from there.
I don't agree that we've ignored the question of Palestinians in this civil liberties campaign. People who attended the large public meeting that we had on campus a few weeks ago, they were treated First off, to an Indigenous student talking about the links between the Indigenous and Palestinian struggles, followed by a Palestinian student wrapped in a kufiya, who ended his speech with "Long live Palestine, long live Gaza," fist in the air. I think we were, in that sense, quite unapologetic about the fact that this was connected to the issue of Palestine. And
response to the meeting, Dave?
Sure. Look, I think that I think that in any political situation, you find yourself alongside people who you don't have control over the tactics of everyone in the campaign. You have to make the best of what is presented, and we started the semester with very little idea about how we were going to actually concretely promote the campaign on campus. Now we've taken that opportunity. I've published articles, as Stuart mentioned, in Electronic Intifada, that people reading that would possibly not have even known that there was a BDS campaign in Australia prior to that. So I think time will tell ultimately whether or not it was the right tactic for the students to adopt. I say that as someone who didn't participate in that protest. I find the idea of boycotting the settlements or a targeted boycott, I just find that incoherent. It's not the settlers that create the settlements, it's the Israeli government that creates the settlement. It's not the army that decides to go and bomb Gaza, it's the Israeli government, the Israeli state that decides to go and bomb Gaza. So it just strikes me as not a logical position to try and separate these things out. Now, I do also think we need to be careful with our language around the KEMP protest. I don't believe that the students were trying to shut down KEMP or deny him the right to speak. They sat outside the lecture theatre for 20 minutes before they decided to come in. If they wanted to stop him speaking, they weren't going about it very well. It was clearly not an effort to no platform KEMP or something like that. So I think we need to do our best to correct the record on that.
I'm still a bit puzzled about the role of Michael Spence, whom I locked horns with soon at a social occasion soon after he arrived in Sydney. But what is his motivation? Is he just a total conformist, or is he an amazing conservative who really wants to promote the right-wing cause?
Let me have a go at that. I've been waiting for you to ask that question for years. Look, I think, in the history of social theory, there's only two traditions. One's about trying to understand conflict, which would get you closer to an idea of what goes on in the world. And the other is a consensus view about disturbing the least number of people, and that's the stable he comes from. He's not sufficiently cosmopolitan enough to take the risks of hearing the voices that he's never heard ever and doesn't really want to hear, because the phenomenon called management, which is somehow equated with a violent notion called efficiency, is really what he subscribes to. And so that absurd notion that a university shouldn't have an opinion is what the wonderful American social scientist Robert Lend in the movement months before the Holocaust, when academics had their heads in the sand but were giving lectures all over the place. He said that they were lecturing on navigation while the ship was going down, and that's precisely the sort of Spence point of view. I don't think he's an appalling disappointment, in particular over his notion that astronomical fees are a way to go for a place called a university, because he's unable or unwilling to even begin to comprehend what the alternative is to the so-called free market. I mean, that's a sort of almost an anti-intellectual stance that he takes on this issue, which is a bit odd for somebody called a Vice-Chancellor.
As someone who's extensively defended the students for their protest, I just feel as though I'd like to stick up for them a bit, Michael, because I think we clearly disagree about this. And you said that you think that the university should be a space for debate and that the protest was inappropriate. Now, I don't think it was tactically inappropriate, but clearly the question, this is not a question about tactics. The only interesting question is a question about whether intrinsically, as a matter of principle, the students were right to disrupt that lecture by KEMP. And I think the way that I want to look at it is this, that of course freedom of speech is a supremely important value, but it's not the only important value, and it's particularly a value which holds in a democracy, in a society where people are equal, where there aren't, weights that prevent access to speech being, attributed to some people more than to others. And I think we want to say that what the students were doing was attacking a propagandist for a brutal several occupation, which only tips the scales of justice in the world in the wrong direction. David's idea that students were prefiguring the kind of polity that we want ultimately to have is, I think, the right way of looking at it. Students were promoting Palestinians' freedom of speech. That seems to me not an empty slogan at all. They were fighting for a world in which there is a major... they were fighting to remove a major impediment to the freedom of speech of Palestinians, it seems to me. To, condemn that on the grounds of some, idealist commitment to the level playing field of ideas just seems to me to get things entirely the wrong way around. They were trying to establish the level playing field of ideas, and it seems to me a sort of idealist fantasy in a way to argue against them on that grounds. So that's the statement, and the question is just one about the target, your support for the targeted boycott. Because it seems to me that the reason that a boycott of the settlements is now on the table is precisely that a more maximal claim has been being forcefully put. And to the extent that that's being made more and more comprehensible and more reasonable sounding through the efforts of the BDS movement, I think people like Mendes and Dierenfurth perhaps and others are beginning to concede a bit of that, namely the settlement boycott. I think we see the dangers in the refugee movement of minimalist claims. The entire refugee movement in Australia, with a few honourable exceptions, has decided to make children the focus of their campaign, saying we've got to get children out of detention. What has that done? It's led to an implicit endorsement of the idea that it's okay to lock up adults. So I think that there's a real problem with, going for what's acceptable, going for what's appropriate, going for the arguments that you think you can get away with.
The claim that targeted BDS is a response to the broader BDS campaign is actually false. So the BDS campaign started maybe around the time of the Second Intifada, I think around 2002. Some people say 2004, but, well, there was an earlier call out. But if you look at, say, Gush Shalom, they called for a boycott of the settlements in the 90s. People like Chomsky were calling for boycotts, cutting American ties to the Israeli military and so on, I think from the 70s and 80s. So that predates the official BDS thing by a long time. So I think that's just factually false. In terms of the protest, one was tactically inappropriate, which I do think it was tactically inappropriate, and do you balance the moral issue? Like I said, after the protest, firstly you can just measure how tactically successful it was. Did it prevent KEMP from talking? No. Did it raise awareness of KEMP's position on Gaza or even about the issue of Gaza? The answer is no. There was no discussion of the Palestinians, there was no discussion of what KEMP said. Like, KEMP gave an interview where he compared the tunnels in Gaza to Auschwitz. Like, do you know how obscene that is? I mean, that should have been a disgrace. And no one, like, even I couldn't work it into the speech because all of the discussion is about, has freedom of speech been violated and all these other things. And so I feel like it just gave this huge stick to beat student protesters with and to give the high ground to the Jewish communal organizations to pretend like they care about freedom of speech. So I think it was a complete disaster tactic. Then you say you should balance freedom of speech against other issues and that it concretely promotes Palestinian freedom of speech. And I think that's nonsense because it just made it easier to suppress Palestinian advocates and say they don't really care about freedom of speech, they're all hypocrites, and so on. And in terms of the broader issue of freedom of speech, there's something, I think in America they call it heckler's veto. So if hecklers can prevent people from speaking, you don't really have freedom of speech. So if someone's going to talk about something controversial and they're just prevented from speaking, it starts out like that, but, for people in the Jewish community like Vivian, we have the experience of not being allowed to speak about the issue of Palestine because, the Jewish community doesn't like what we have to say. So when you're from a left-wing background and you're used to, hanging out with people who agree with you, it's very easy to think, well, we're not going to be the ones that silence, we're standing up. But, the protest can go the other way too. So I think that, I really just have no idea how this is supposed to have helped the Palestinian cause when it's drawn no attention to it, has generally received nothing but negative attention, and at best, we've just tried to explain why Jake Lynch is an anti-Semitic, which, in my view, is a step backwards in public discussion.
With respect, Michael, I don't think the argument is being made that the call for a targeted boycott of settlements came chronologically after the more general boycott call. The argument that is being made, I think, is that the political space to advocate it is expanded by the existence and iteration of the more maximal boycott call at the other end of the same spectrum. Indeed, I haven't asked my question till now because I've been struggling to remember the person's name, and I haven't, but there is a person who is a very impressive young member of the Knesset for the Meretz party who gave an interview, which I read sometime last year, in which she explained how she was avoiding any contact with the settlements on the explicit rationale that if that particular form of boycott was not activated with sufficient vigour, it would lead to a much more widespread call for the more maximal boycott in the wider world, and that would be to the detriment of Israel, in her view. So it's the willingness of some of us to advocate for that more maximal boycott which expands the political space into which other versions of the boycott can be iterated. It's not about the chronological order in which they happen. And by the way, I hope you're all joining me in hoping that FIFA decide to suspend the Israeli Football Association.
Well, I was hoping for a bit of a debate from my speech, and it seems like I've got it. So to respond to what Jake said, I think in the more subtle form, I can concede maybe a little bit that because there's a more radical position, that it may have made other calls for boycott seem a little bit more moderate. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of other factors. So I think that there has been a much broader case that Israel's public image has really declined internationally. So I think it was the second war really in Lebanon in 1982, which was the first real blow to Israel's public image because it killed something like 20,000 people, and there was a Sabra and Shatila massacre. And that was probably the first break where it didn't seem like Israel was, the victim that was being picked on, because it was a tiny country that they were bombing. So the second intifada, there were suicide bombings, and so that probably worked to Israel's favor. But then you have the war in Lebanon in 2006, where there was quite a lot of media coverage, and the death toll was pretty unbalanced. There was the war on Gaza in 2009, where something like 1,400 Palestinians were killed. And then there was Protective Edge last year, and then there was the massacre of the Mavi Marmara, the flotilla, which I'm sure many of you remember. Because there has been such terrible massacres by Israel, and also, there are other factors. Norman Finkelstein writes about there's a lot more scholarship. So from the 80s, the Israeli archives started to be opened and really examined by scholars like Benny Morris, Avi Shleim, Simcha Flappen, Tom Segev. And they looked through the archives, and it showed that Israel expelled Palestinians in the 48 war, and it did lots of terrible things. And it became... So my basic point is that there's a lot of factors which has led to a decline in Israel's public image. And it's possible that BDS has played a role. But I think there's pros and cons in it, and I think that... I still stand by my statements. I think that they're a soft target, and that's why they get picked on, and not people like not people like Ben Saul or Amnesty International, who call for a different type of boycott because that's a more defensible one.
Any attack on Israel in general is portrayed as an attack on Jews by the Murdoch media and so on, very deliberately so. My question is to ask you, why is it that the Australian Press Council, knowing this fully well, is not doing anything about it? They seem to be acting as a sort of silent spectator. Any one of you, including Stuart, can answer.
The major institutions are as conservative and cautious as Professor Michael Spence. They don't have, I mean, courage in public life is so rare. When you talk to the ABC, for example, about them taking a stand that might be imitated by the Press Council, they're scared stiff of the avalanche of mail, of critical mail, incredibly well organised, that they will receive the following day. So they keep their heads below the trenches, and they avoid the controversy, so there's a sort of uncritical assumption that the dismay about the Holocaust is so strong still, even if the Palestinians had nothing to do with it, that in official circles no question should be raised. But it's a question of courage. I mean, I told Lee Sales not very long ago that when last time she interviewed Mark Redjeff, the spokesperson for the Israeli government, I said to her, "You stroked him with a feather. You didn't interview him." And it's that metaphor, if you like, that's I'm sure goes on characterises the behaviour of the press council.
We certainly haven't exhausted this issue. But as someone who's got a lot of scars from a lot of campaigns, I just want to make a couple of points. The idea that we should go softly on BDS really ignores the history of the organisation of any protest movement. I remember, we still have universal health insurance on the books because a group of us about, 25 years ago now, ran the Defend and Extend Medicare campaign. And we made all sorts of mistakes to begin with. You might argue that mistakes were made at the Colonel KEMP lecture, but the idea that those mistakes therefore damn a campaign forever and a day is absurd if you look at the history of learning how best to become powerful and sophisticated in organising a movement for justice. It's often one step forward and two steps back, and that's particularly in what I call the liabilities of newness in the early stages of a campaign. That frequently happens, and the solidarity between us and the arguments that you've contributed to, that we've all contributed to, are, if you like, a process of learning. But we're talking about what Gideon Levy recently called the systematic dehumanization of a whole people. That's why we have to take a stand on this issue. It's not, in a way, what happened to Colonel for 10 minutes or whatever it was at Colonel KEMP is a drop in the ocean. The idea that we should be somehow sort of politically paralysed because mistakes might or might not have been made at that shows it doesn't pick up on the whole history of movements. And I imagine if you talk to Faith Bandler about the campaigns to ensure that Aboriginal people of Australia became citizens, she would identify all sorts of mistakes that were made at the beginning, and we learn from that. And next time, BDS is going to take 3 steps forward and only 1 step back. But I would be ashamed, personally, if we didn't get behind the BDS campaign, because so many people in Israel as well as elsewhere have said it's the only chink of light there is.
Please thank Michael and David.